to Bio 1441. This is Professor Caravat coming to you from my underground secret bio bunker, writing out the 2020 plague, right? All right, hope everyone's healthy and okay. I don't mean to make light of things, but what else can you do sometimes but watch the absurdity? I hope all is well. I'm recording this plenty early before you need to watch this video, but I want to point out that exam 3 is coming up in a couple weeks. There's a guided reading questions posted online, your active reading guide, and that every Friday we have a short few 5 to 10 questions, maybe a few more depending on the situation, over that week's lecture video. So keep up with the content, please. Best way to do well in the course. Okay, so last time we talked about gymnosperms. This week we're going to talk about angiosperms. Angiosperms are the clade of flowering plants. And this includes things you might not think of as flowering plants. Grass, wheat, oak trees. Those are all flowering plants. Most of the plants you know, except things like pines, are flowering plants. They're the most diverse group on the planet. And they really don't show up until the Mesozoic. So the time of the dinosaurs is when flowering plants first evolved. And one of the things that they have that makes them unique are flowers, of course, and they're ovule. Ovules are the fancy way to say unfertilized seeds. So a flowering plant ovule has an outer coating. This is a little bit uncalibrated, bear with me. It actually has a double outer coating. So this is going to be the seed coat eventually. Your book will refer to this probably as an integument. It becomes the seed coat when it's mature. Okay, so this is going to be the seed coat. And that's the same thing as integument. Okay, and I'm going to show you, what I'm going to show you first of all is the female or mega gametophyte of a flowering plant, and I'm only going to show you part of it because we're not going to go full botany today. What we have in here, two important things. Down here is going to be the egg, and then up here is a great big cell with two nuclei in it called the central cell. So pollen grain lands up here on the top of the flower. We'll talk about that later. And the pollen tube grows down here, okay? Two sperm are released. One of them is going to fertilize this central cell, and one of them is going to fertilize this egg. So we have a new thing that we didn't see in conifers called double fertilization. This is only found in flowering plants. The central cell plus sperm. So notice this is weird. There are two nuclei in here. So this is N, this is hard to write, N plus N inside of this cell. Now here comes a sperm into there, right? So when that gets fertilized, it becomes a triploid tissue called endosperm. That grows into food for the embryo. And when the egg gets fertilized, it of course forms the zygote. Now in conifers, they have food in the embryo, but they really just eat the female gametophyte. I didn't go into that in detail, but that's what they eat. But flowering plants have an even more nutritious source of food called endosperm. And endosperm is what we eat when we eat flour and grind grain into flour, or when we eat rice. That's endosperm. We're eating that nutrition that was meant for the baby plant. And then if you eat the seed coat and you eat the embryo, then you're eating whole grain. Isn't that weird? All right. So these seed plants appear in the Cretaceous, and that's followed by an explosion of insect diversity, because what we have going on is something that we haven't really mentioned in class. We have two organisms helping each other, well, I say helping, quote unquote, two organisms affecting each other's evolution, and that is known as coevolution. So this is when you have flowers evolving and then insects pollinating flowers, and then flowers evolving to attract more insects, and insects evolving to eat nectar from flowers, and they push each other in an evolutionary direction. So here we see some Deinonychus, my favorite dinosaur, related to like Velociraptor, and we have, although my favorite might be Stegosaurus. My favorite carnivore is Deinonychus, but overall Stegosaurus Steve was kind of my thing as a kid. I think I'll stick to Stegosaurus. I thought about getting a tattoo of Stegosaurus. What do you think? Would that be cool? No? Wouldn't be? Oh, damn. Okay. Anyway, so during the Cretaceous, we have the evolution of these things. They are now the most abundant and diverse group of land plants, meaning they're everywhere and they're very diverse. They co-evolved with animals in a couple of ways, especially pollinators with the insects and seed dispersal. Animals often eat the seeds and poop them out somewhere. They spread the seeds around, or the seeds hook onto your clothes and or your fur, and you carry them around and drop them off. So they've evolved to take advantage of animals in many ways. When I was a grad student, I had a fossil site from Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, from the Cretaceous period, from about 90 million years ago. And these are a whole bunch of flowering plant fossils that I found there. These are what we see here so this is not too long after they first show up. We have flowers and tons of different kinds of fruits of various kinds. Here's another flower, and just all kinds of neat diversity that rapidly show up after the Cretaceous, or during the Cretaceous period. Most of these have not yet been described to science, so have a look there. There's unpublished fossils. Now, I mentioned earlier what's in a flowering plant ovule. Now let's put that in context. Here's the ovules inside of a flower. Let me turn on my fake laser pointer here. So here's an ovule. An ovule is a immature seed, meaning it's not fertilized yet. That's an ovule. There's a bunch of them in here, okay? So we're going to look at this structure that flowering plants have that conifers do not, and that's called the flower. Now, at the heart of the flower is an organ called a carpel. You might have learned it as a pistil, but its proper name is carpel. Carpel has three parts that you need to know. Stigma is this platform up here where pollen can land. Style is just this connection between the stigma and the lower part here, the swollen base known as an ovary. Ovaries produce ovules. Now, if we were going to zoom into an ovule, there'd be a gametophyte in there with an egg. Okay? Now, after fertilization, that ovule becomes a seed and there's an embryo inside and food for the embryo. Okay? But this is before that in this picture. So, this is why flowering plants are so good at living on land. Look at what they do here. They protect their embryos inside an ovule. Those ovules are protected inside an ovary. What does an ovary become after fertilization? You look at this and you tell me. After sperm meets egg, what will that ovary become? I'll wait. A fruit. The ovary becomes a fruit. So, apple, orange, kiwi, strawberry. Those are structures that might have more than one flower part involved, but there is an ovary involved, okay? And there are seeds inside. And animals can eat them, poop them out, spread the seeds around, or the fruit might have a wing on it and it can fly in the wind somewhere. There's lots of kinds of fruits, but they are structures that allow for seed dispersal in one way or another typically, or they at least protect these seeds. Now, outside of that, what's the next whirl of parts? We see these parts, which are derived from leaves. They're homologous to leaves, and they're called stamens. Stamens have two basic parts, the stalk called the filament, and then the head on top of the stalk called the anther. That's basically a sporangium. It makes spores, but the spores grow into pollen grains. So we can skip the life cycle and just say stamens make pollen grains. Okay, so pollen grains are made there. Pollen grains make sperm, right? So pollen grains are made there. Now, outside of that, one step further, not all flowers have this, but many do. We have petals. Petals are often colorful. If they're colorful, that means this plant is animal pollinated. If they're not colorful or they don't exist or whatever, then it might be wind pollinated. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then sometimes outside of that, you have another layer of structures known as a sepal, which are usually green and look more like a leaf. But every part of this flower is homologous to a leaf. Leaves with seeds hanging off the bottom that roll up, forming a carpel, or leaves that make spores that roll up, forming an anther, right? All right, so that's the parts of a flower. Now, flowering plants. Their gametophytes are really tiny and you won't see them without a microscope, okay? They can be wind or animal pollinated. They protect their seeds in first, so they have an embryo protected in an ovule, which is a seed, and then the seeds are protected in a fruit. And this is kind of confusing. I shouldn't have written it quite like that. Let me correct this. So seeds, just remember, seeds are ovules. Fruits typically develop from ovaries, right? All right, that's good. Now, what I want to show you here is just a couple examples of something. So we talked about endosperm. That's formed by double fertilization. Double fertilization produces that triploid endosperm, food for the embryo. If you eat whole grain, if you eat just white rice, you're just eating endosperm, okay? If you eat whole grain, you're eating the endosperm and you're eating the seed coat, the integument, and other things. So, and the germ, which is germ, if you hear germ like wheat germ, that's the embryo, okay? So when you eat whole grains, you're eating the germ, the endosperm, and the seed coat. That's what a whole grain is. If you ever eat coconut, there's an embryo right there in a coconut. I hope you can see that. Letter A, and then B is part of the fruit there, and then the liquid that was inside the coconut, that's endosperm, triploid endosperm, food for the embryo. Pretty cool. So double fertilization produces a triploid endosperm, that's coconut milk or the white starchy endosperm of grains that we eat so often, that we make bread out of and everything else. That's what endosperm is. Food for the embryo. So just to remind you, let's talk about the difference between, well, to remind you and to learn for the first time part of this, students get confused between pollination and fertilization, okay? Pollination, by definition, is when pollen, and I'm talking flowering plants here, is when pollen lands, let me fix that, lands on the stigma. That's pollination, which is completely different than fertilization, which is when egg and central cell, which is this right here, egg and central cell fertilized. All right, so pollen grain lands right here. Boop. That's as close as that pollen grain, come on. That's as close as that pollen grain is ever going to get to the egg. Then, the long journey of the sperm elevator, as I mentioned in a previous video, the pollen tube grows out of the pollen grain. Grows all the way down from the stigma, down the style, down here, and it finds an opening. There's an opening, they kind of show it down here, right here. There's an opening, grows in here, releases a sperm right here in the egg, releases a sperm right here for the two polar nuclei, or well, we're just going to call it the central cell with two nuclei in it, and that produces the endosperm. That's double fertilization. So fertilization is when eggs and sperm meet. Pollination is just when pollen lands on the flower here, on the stigma. Now, there's one other thing to remember then is seed dispersal. Once that ovary turns into fruit and the ovule turns into a seed, seed dispersal is how that seed with that baby in it gets out away from the parent plant. Like you might eat it and then poop it out. That's seed dispersal. It might hook on your fur and you carry it off in the woods. That's seed dispersal, not pollination. That's the baby. Remember, seed dispersal has to do with how does the baby get put out there away from the parent, whereas pollination is how does the sperm get to the plant. Students confuse that all the time. Don't miss that on the test. That's easy. So here's an example of a very common, it's actually a fruit you're familiar with. It's corn. Corn has a seed coat. I call it a fruit because the outer part of the corn is actually from the ovary. So we have endosperm inside, we have stored food, we have the embryo in there that's going to grow up to be the new corn plant once this thing starts to grow. This outer coating, this seed coat here, that is protective, that is waterproof, that protects the embryo. And then it absorbs water, lets some in, that wakes up the enzymes inside of that corn plant. The embryo will then start digesting and eating that endosperm and grow until it starts to photosynthesize. So just to reemphasize, if you're eating grain, an example, a whole grain would be rice. If you ate just white rice, that's endosperm only. If you eat brown rice, that's the bran. Which is just part of the seed coat, basically. As well as the embryo and the endosperm. The embryo often called like germ, like wheat germ. So if you're eating a whole grain, you're eating the whole thing. If you're eating just white rice, you're eating just the sugary, starchy endosperm. Same applies to other grains, whole grains versus just the endosperm. Like when you have white bread, it's made from just the endosperm. When you have whole wheat bread, it's made from the whole grain. You're eating the baby, the protective coating, and the food for the embryo in that case. So if we look at all of the different kinds of plants, this is a great figure to just remember how this kind of works. So in the mosses, way down here at the bottom, mosses, they have a dominant gametophyte, meaning it's big and green, lives a long time. The sporophyte is tiny, and it's plugged into the gametophyte for food. It doesn't photosynthesize on its own. Now we move to the ferns. Now we have a gametophyte that's small. It can live on its own. It can photosynthesize. It's free living. But the sporophyte lives longer and is bigger and dominant. Then we move into seed plants. In this case, the gametophyte is so small that it's typically microscopic. It can't photosynthesize, so it gets all of its nutrition from the parent plant. The sporophyte's dominant. And then we can see some images of the gymnosperms, which make cones, and the angiosperms that make flowers. So we can see that here. I'll let you review that. Now, I like to think of it this way. Mosses and ferns are kind of like the amphibians of the plant world. They have swimming sperm, need to have water for sex. Gymnosperms are kind of like the lizards of the plant world. They have internal fertilization, but the one that really is exploded in diversity are the angiosperms. They're like the mammals of the plant world. They provide more food for their embryo, kind of like we provide milk, right? They protect their embryos. They have internal fertilization. They get insects to carry their pollen around for them. So flowers can be wind pollinated, or they can put their sperm on the back of a bee. So remember, pollen is not sperm, but there are sperm in pollen. They put the pollen on the back of a bee and send it out. That's why botanists call bees flying penises, because they're covered in plant sperm, basically. So I just want to mention then a couple things before we go, that plants don't move. They can't run off. So one other cool thing about plants is that they have evolved a number of unique characteristics based on the fact that they're stationary. They've co-evolved with animals, right? Pollination and seed dispersal. They have also evolved chemical defenses because they can't run, so they get you with poison. So let me show you a few examples. Here is a beetle eating pollen, getting covered in pollen at the same time. It's going to move off to another flower. It's going to get that pollen on the stigma of that other flower, and we'll have fertilization take place after that. Here is a flower that smells like rotting meat. It attracts flies. They pollinate by spreading the pollen around. There's a bee. Bees really like yellow and blue flowers. They're attracted to yellow and blue, and they get covered in pollen. You can see the pollen all over the back of this bee. It's going to fly to another flower now. Pollination will take place when that pollen rubs off, so we're spreading the pollen grains and their sperm onto a new flower. Pollen tubes will grow out. We'll fertilize the egg. Those ovules will become seeds. The ovaries will become fruits. Something will eat the fruit, disperse the seeds, and we'll have a new plant growing somewhere. A lot of plants, though, Even angiosperms still do wind pollination, especially things like oak trees and sycamore trees, and these are the ones that cause allergies because they have tiny pollen grains because they make tons of them and they put a lot of them into the air. And so if you are a wind pollinated flower, you're not going to have a smell that smells good. You're not going to have pretty colors because wind doesn't care. Your stamens are going to be really long so they catch the wind and spray your pollen everywhere. Your stigmas will have lots of surface area so they can catch pollen grains more easily. And these are going to be really common in climates like now, like here, Arkansas, where there's wind and lots of open space. Not as common in like a rainforest where it's wet and the wind wouldn't carry the pollen very far. So wind pollinated flowers usually aren't very sexy. So here is a flower of this is a hazelnut tree. Those are a whole bunch of flowers hanging there. They don't look very pretty. They don't care. They don't need to be pretty. They just need wind. Here's another example. There's cornflowers. Not very pretty, right? They don't care. They need wind. So those are the female flowers. There's the male cornflowers. Those make pollen and that's it. They blow in the wind, then they're done. They don't need to be pretty. But plants, like I said, don't move. They're rooted in spot, and that means they have evolved a bunch of chemicals. Some of the chemicals smell good. They attract pollinators. Ooh, that smells sweet. Yum, 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 yum. Or, ooh, that smells like dead meat. Yum, 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 yum. And that attracts pollinators. If plants could walk around and have sex, and defend themselves, you probably wouldn't see these chemicals. But because plants are rooted in spot, same with fungus too, by the way, stuck in one place, they're like a fortress. When you defend a castle, you dump hot oil out and things like that onto the people attacking you. You can't pick up your castle and run off. When you're stuck in place, you make chemical defenses. We don't grind up kittens for medicine. Why? There's hardly any animals that have any medicinal value. Why? Because we all make about the same chemicals. We're all related. We all run around. We defend ourselves. We attract mates in other ways. But plants are stuck in one spot. They make tons of chemicals. Some of those chemicals include things like morphine, quinine, Taxol, THC, cocaine, nicotine, caffeine. All of those things are plant-based chemicals that we have now used for our drugs. So over 50, or at least 50% of our drugs come from plants or fungus, or are now synthetically made versions of things we discovered in plants or fungus. So think about that, how important that is for medicine. All right, I think that's about it for plants. We're going to move on to fungus and animal diversity next.